Hi class, Dr. G here. In this video, I'd like to talk a little bit about qualitative research. There are 5 or 6 types of qualitative research that you should be familiar with: ethnography, case study, grounded theory, in-depth interviews, focus groups, and narration. The ethnography is an in-depth study of a culture. The best known ethnographer is Jane Goodall. In 1960, she went to Africa to study chimpanzees, and she immersed herself in the chimpanzee culture. She essentially lived with them. And as far as I know, she's still there. Case study is, again, an in-depth study of an event. The one that comes to mind is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The researcher studied that from various perspectives, in depth. Grounded theory, it's a little more complicated to describe. It's not one that I want to spend a lot of time with, but essentially what the researcher is doing is studying a group of people and comparing what the researcher finds, the criteria, the elements of his or her research, and comparing them together. What the purpose of grounded theory is to develop a theory based on your research, based on what you're uncovering in your investigation. So I don't want to say a whole lot more about that because we're not going to talk much more about that in this class. In-depth interview is a very common interview for social sciences. It's also called a phenomenological interview because what we are trying to accomplish when we do an in-depth interview is determine how people make meaning of their experiences. So in my first announcement, I gave you an example of flight attendants asking customers to give up their seats for other employees of the airline so they could get to a destination to catch a flight. And the research question asked, how do those flight attendants describe that experience? And that's what we're looking for. Focus groups, you're probably more familiar with focus groups than anything else. Most recently, during the presidential election, we saw focus groups being used after debates. Essentially, 12 to 15 people are put together and the interviewer interviews them in an open forum. So each respondent hears the response of the other respondents. Narration is associated with biographies and those kinds of things. So no need to talk a great deal about that. What I would like to focus on is what the strengths and weaknesses of qualitative research are. In quantitative research, we know that the data is analyzed by the use of numbers, whereas in qualitative research, it's analyzed by the use of words and images. So in a qualitative study, the researcher goes through the transcription of the investigation and looks for patterns and themes that keep repeating during the process, and then comes to a conclusion. The strength of a quantitative study is that the results can be generalized because we're using statistics. And if our results are statistically significant, and we'll talk about what statistical significance is at a later video, but if they're statistically significant, the researcher can apply those results to another similar population. So for instance, if we were studying animal-assisted therapy in hospices in Delaware, and hospices in Pennsylvania wanted to consider animal-assisted therapy, but needed financing to do it, they needed funds, they could take the statistically significant results from Delaware and argue that they don't need to do their own study ahead of time, and therefore hopefully get the funding for the results. That's what generalization is. The weakness of qualitative studies is that that the studies can't be generalized. So the strength of quantitative is generalization. The weakness of qualitative is it can't be generalized. Results can't be generalized. The results can only apply to the people in the study, the participants of the study. The weaknesses of quantitative studies are that we get narrow data, not a lot of information. So if you go back to our video on the surveys, respondents can answer one of 5 choices they have. They may want to say it's a 3, but really it's a 4. They have no opportunity to explain the difference. They have to choose one number. And the information you gather from that is not very detailed or very voluminous. And that's fine because what's important is the statistics. Okay, if the statistics are right, the results are statistically significant and the hypothesis can be disconfirmed. The null hypothesis is disconfirmed. In qualitative research, you get a broad amount of information. A colleague of mine interviewed 9 people for 4 hours each, 36 hours of interviews. For every hour of interview, he had 8 single-page pages of text from the transcription, almost 300 pages. So the information you get from qualitative studies is very broad. So again, the strengths of one are the weaknesses of the other. So the strength of quantitative is generalization. The weakness of qualitative is generalization. The strengths of qualitative is broad information. The weakness of quantitative is narrow information. Okay, it's as simple as that. Okay, hope you're with me, still with me? Okay, so as you go through your research articles, be looking for those kinds of types of studies: ethnography, case study, in-depth interviews. In an in-depth interview, the researcher would construct a semi-structured interview. The researcher would probably list 5 questions beforehand and then would ask follow-up questions for every answer that the researcher gets for the structured questions. And that's what gives the researcher a great deal of information. Okay, and so when you're going through your articles, be looking for that. If you see a lot of statistical information, it's probably a quantitative study. In qualitative studies, what you normally see is excerpts from the interview. You'll see what the respondents had to say instead of seeing a lot of statistics. Okay, so that's essentially qualitative research in a nutshell. If you have any questions, again, always feel free to text me, and I hope this was helpful. I look forward to speaking with you again in another video. Take care and good luck.